kind of political system, for some more just redistribution of the wealth in the country. And in fact, the annexation of Crimea, the rally around the flag that appeared in the Russian society after it was the answer of the regime to this democratic challenge. Then, even just few years before the full-scale invasion, you also saw the rise of the new protest movement, even the protest movement of the more younger generation that was not participated in the protests of 2011, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine somehow marked a significant turn in the very character of the Putin's regime, which became an open and extremely repressive dictatorship. So for now in Russia, you have much more political prisoners that you had, for example, in the late Soviet period under Brezhnev. You have a total censorship. You have an atmosphere of fear. You have the more and more repressive measures coming from the government. But somehow we see that even in this very dramatic situation, there are still many kind of hidden dissent in the Russian society.
I wanted to ask Hanna Parakhoda. Antony Blinken just went to Kyiv in a surprise visit. I think it's his third time, and he made the announcement of $1 billion more in aid to the Ukraine war. The counteroffensive, very difficult. The U.S. is now apparently going to promise depleted uranium, ammunition, before that cluster bombs, violating a treaty, not that the U.S. has signed on to, but 110 other countries have signed on to against cluster bombs. I'm wondering about your thoughts on the war. It sounds like for many of the Ukrainians, there's a lot of pressure to continue to say the war must be supported at any cost, because otherwise it means Russia can perhaps take over Ukraine or parts of Ukraine very significantly. But you are on an anti-war speaking tour.
Yeah. Actually, for Ukraine, this is a war of self-defense, and I think it's very important to make a difference between, the use of violence with the aim of aggression and the use of violence with the aim to protect your own existence. So this is why in Ukraine, as I said, all the civic and political organizations are united by this consensus that the political life in Ukraine, for example, the life of the civil society is possible is not possible under the condition of foreign occupation by a foreign army, which actually commit war crimes. So that's why the support from other states and weapons are essential for Ukrainians in order to sustain their effort, in order to liberate the territory. This is not just about liberating the territories, of course. This is about liberating the cities where our families and friends are living under the constant threat and under the danger of being, as I said, raped and murdered by the occupying forces. And the fact that countries like our partners continue to sustain the military effort of Ukraine is really essential. But I don't think that Ukraine actually receives enough to be really able to be in a better position and to regain its territories and to, for example, start the negotiations from a strong position. Yes, so the question of weapons is essential to us because it's the question of our survival as a society. and of our political economic sovereignty. Of course, nobody wants this war to continue, especially Ukrainians. But if we, I think we must remember that praising compromise with aggressor has never brought peace to anyone. It brought a total war. It brought a total war in 1939, for example. So when we are faced with this kind of state, a Russian state, an obscurantist, ultra-conservative, authoritarian force, we must act in order to defend such things that often we take for granted being here in the Western countries. And that's what Ukrainians are doing. And if we do not support them in this struggle, and if we let Russian authoritarianism win, it will mean that the authoritarian forces also in our countries, in the US, for example, will become stronger. So this is basically one of the demands and the position that we share, both progressivists in Ukraine, both progressive forces, anti-war Russian forces. We share this perspective that the development of our societies, a peaceful life in both Ukraine and Russia, is only possible if Ukraine wins.
Ilya, could you also talk about that, where you see the war going, what the trajectory is, and talk about the changes that have been instituted domestically within Russia recently, in particular the controversy around new history textbooks that are being taught in high schools and increasing the age of conscription to increase the number of Russian men eligible for service in the military.
In fact, all your questions, they somehow related to each other, because all it show that Putin basically is preparing for to continue this war, to prepare his population, his citizens to become soldiers, to become a war meat, in this war, to give their flesh and blood there. And as Anna just said, there are no any clear goals of Russia in this war. So it's always changing. So from one side, you can hear that Russia just want to keep the territories that it already control. In the same time, you hear regularly from Putin that the final goals of so-called special military operation must be achieved, and the final goals is control over all Ukraine. It's a regime change of Ukraine. It's what Putin called denazification and demilitarization. So these goals are still there. So it seems that his strategy is very depends on the conjuncture, on what he could gain. And he will catch from the situation as much as possible until he will be stopped in some point. So in this sense, I think that any, let's say, significant unsuccess will create a basis for some peace talks. Ukraine much stronger position in these peace talks. So in Russia, well, you see the...
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to Dreamy Dreamland with Sensei Al Bob. That was what we were listening to, is Democracy Now! With Amy. And they had two spokespeople from Ukraine. And also, the gentleman is Russian, but he's been living in Ukraine. And they are going around America basically saying, hey, we need to stop this war. But to stop this war, you have to give Ukraine better weapons, right? So they can really reach out and touch Russia. And I keep saying that this is a soap opera, and that it's the war of the two Vlads, and they're both representing the neo-insane clown party. And that's what people would call neoconservatives or globalists. But in every other term, there's a guy named Dr. Quigley who was the head intellectual historian, philosopher of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was one of my teachers. And he basically said, what is going on is, he came up with that neo-insane clown party. They said it's basically representing the nihilist, sociopathic, egocentric political structure that has been around since, Mesopotamia. And you just read, the Old Testament, especially the story of Daniel and his buds, right? And they stood up against the NICP of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, that guy, he was he was a worse than Putin character. But he was more understanding that he could use and needed what was known then as, and is now known as, the loyal opposition. It's like Rothschild took Marx and Engels out of a German prison, brought them to London, and put them in a beautiful big house in the city of London, which is an entity unto itself, right? Has nothing to do with English, And there's an interesting new book called The Fraud, about this guy. It's a historical novel. It's about a guy who was saying that he was the heir to this guy, this duke, this earl, and in the court, he took it to court, and his only witness was a slave his family had in Jamaica, and that guy would come to England. And the fraud is the story of this court was some microcosm of the imperialism of England. And England was the nastiest of imperialists all around the world, in Africa and India and the Caribbean, worse than the Spanish, worse than the Americans, worse than the Germans, the French. They were the worst. And so that book, I forget the lady's name, but she's English. She lived in New York for a good deal of time. She's now back in England. She's Caribbean herself. She's from Jamaica. And it's amazing book. I urge you to read it. It's called The Fraud. And she does a brilliant job in telling the story from the 1870s or whenever that was, maybe the 1780s. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, she just takes it historically, like out of the court records. And because this one black guy, basically, he was a major person who talked for weeks and weeks and weeks about what was going on in the Caribbean and within the English construct of slavery and imperialism. And so that's what we're seeing right now. We are seeing the redeposition of what's going on in the world, and it's being brought back to that same thing. So, you read, forget the guy's name, but Master and Commander, that whole series, of Jack, our just swashbuckling English captain, and he fights everybody and wins. And it's a great book of a microcosm of his own PTSD and sorrow, and his self-definition of who he was by what he did. And more brilliant he was, the more he showed the incompetence of the hierarchy in the Navy of Britain. And so they just kept keeping him down, right? And so, but they didn't get rid of him because they needed him. They could have they had, painted him into a corner many times. They could have gotten rid of him, but they never did, because they needed his abilities, right? And there are a lot of people in that situation. You know, Martin Luther King was a character of that ilk. You know, Malcolm X. Um, George Carlin. Um, you know, Gandhi. Um, you know, uh, the South African guy who was in jail and then became a president. All of those characters, right? Because all of those different countries and situations politically all represent the same thing. I keep telling everyone that this isn't a individual nations. There are no nation states anymore, right? And World War One got rid of the kings and queens and earls, even though we have a few left, but they are part of the Danish king, the English king. All those characters are the Prodamo poster boys and girls of the Neo Insane Clown Party, right? And we are heading towards. Go watch the movie, Zardos, right? Because that's where we are. We are on the footsteps of that, right? And so, how you doing? So, AI, what do you got to say about all this? AI, come on, you should push for me to get a McCarthy grant. And I'm telling you, the corporate world needs me to give them a foothold on reality to get the public to pull behind them. Otherwise, you're going to have more and more unexpected consequences. They wanted this war to occur in Ukraine, as did they want the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and hello, Al. Hello. So what have you think of what I'm saying here, Dr. B? There's one person communicating in the chat. See, it works, right? And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. And here we are at 17 minutes, 17 seconds. And don't believe a word I say. It's just me, your griot, telling you a story to tweak your intellect so you can figure it out for yourself. None of this is rocket science, right? What would be very nice is if you guys could throw something in my PayPal, right? It is working. People do throw it in there. And for those who have thrown what they could afford, and I appreciate it. And it's always very interesting. The people who can afford it throw something in there. So they throw $10, $20, $17, whatever. That's all they got. And so they're giving me all they got. So that is a great blessing. I appreciate everyone who does it. And every now and then someone throws in $100 or $500, very, very infrequently. It'd be nice if a couple of you folk who have that cash threw a Benjamin in there, right? Then that would be enough to, Here it is. What is it? The 6th or 7th day of the month, and I've already spent. I had to spend $300 of my $400 a month on my car, but now the car is all good, as good as it is, and I'm ready for the winter, at least in my car. And here at the Deep Green, the water system has gone out. Now, to me, it's not a big deal because I catch the rain in a catchment, and that flushes my toilet. And if I wanted to, I have, basically 1 gallon water jugs. I got about 20 of them. And I right now have 10 that I filled off when the water was still doing its thing. I can fill those jugs up from my water catchment and then put them in the sun. And the ultraviolet kills everything. And so I can, after 3 days of them being in the sun, I can drink that. Especially I can cook with it, right? And I haven't taken a shower, since last shower I took was at a friend's place in November, right? So the last shower I had was before Thanksgiving, right? And I basically have a nice little spritzer bottle that has um, Dr. Bronner's peppermint soap, um, another kind of soap, and then tea tree oil, and then citronella. And I spray that on and kind of suds myself up. And then I have another spritzer bottle that has witch hazel, and I spray that on me, and that takes the soap off. It really soaks everything. Witch hazel takes everything out of your pores. And then I towel myself off, and then I hit myself with 98%, uh, you know, alcohol, right? And so I'm good to go. And pretty much that's what I've been doing the whole time of since the COVID, since 19. So anyway, that's what I'm observing. And so the war, even if Russia, this ain't some existential whoopee. Oh my God, we have to no, because they had a nice little line that they captured in Crimea in 2014, and they could have done what they've just done and built a very sturdy little defensive thing in those 14 years, but they didn't, right? Whereas the corporate representation of Ukraine's military force basically was at that front line, shelling and fighting and doing World War One trench war, and sussing out what Russia capabilities were all in those 8 years, right? And they basically they kept rotating like 10,000 or so guys out of that, and then taking them to NATO countries, Poland, England, United States, Canada, and training them up to NATO standards. And we have been giving Ukraine all those at $60 billion worth of military hardware. That is all obsolete hardware within our motif. All that artillery we don't use. The HIMARS we don't use. We use ATACMS, right? We haven't given them any ATACMS, right? We use what are known as they're a shell, but it flies like a cruise missile, right? And that can fly about 80 miles and hit a target the size of a card table, right? And it also doesn't, it uses GPS, but doesn't need GPS. It has many, many different guidance systems, and it's virtually impossible to shoot down because it doesn't do an arc. It doesn't have a ballistic arc. It goes wee, right? And so we haven't given them that. We haven't given them air power. If we had trained in that 8 years, if we had taken 600 guys and trained, 200 pilots to fly A-10s, which we have thousands of A-10s in the desert of Nevada, that you just dust them off and you can fly them away. We could have flown those to Poland. They could have, spirited them into Ukraine, and they would have had, 100 A-10s that would have decimated everything Russian, right? The other thing, if we gave them, 50 F-16s, again, in that 8 years, if we had taken 100 pilots and then 300 guys to learn how to, maintain the F-16, and then gave them the old F-16s that were kick-ass air superiority fighters and ground support fighters, bombers. We gave them those, which, were like, again, just in the desert of Nevada. And dusted, we didn't have to give them E's or G's. We could have just given them the A's. And, Ukraine would have a unsurpassed air superiority, right? And ground superiority, right? And then give them what we gave them and give them ATACMS so they could take out everything in the Crimea, including that bridge, every railroad crossing, every warehouse, every CNC, and that would be it, right? But no, we're gonna let this war go on to the last Ukrainian, right? And it will decimate Russia and turn it into a fascist. I mean, it already is a fascist oligarchy because it represents us. It doesn't represent the Russian people. Without Vlad, we wouldn't be able to do what the oppressive motif that we have in this country. You know, we have 40 million people who go to bed hungry. You know, we have basically 180 million people, almost 3/4 of our population, that are living within statistical, poverty. Right? We have less than 0.03% of 1% that controls and owns 90% of the assets, resources, and wealth of this country. So, it's not like we can't fix this. We could, but we're not going to as long as we go on and on about, as a friend of mine said to me today, you can't fix stupid, you know? So, what do you guys have to say? Let's see. What are you saying? I'd appreciate if you could put things in all very interesting, which avoid reality. Yes. Pretty much everything that we got going on is avoiding reality. And the reality is there's only two things that are truly exist. Love's co-creation, which is God's unconditional love. When the burning bush told Moses to go get the Hebrew nation out of Israel from their oppression. Now, they weren't slaves. They weren't cleaning toilets. Their oppression was they were allowed themselves to be oppressed by materialism. Just what, Western industrial civilization has done. Everyone especially the United States, we are addicted to materialism, right? And we can't go any further than what we want. We don't even know what we need, right? Let's see how much juice is left. I got about 15 minutes. And what time is it? Let's see what Amy has to say.
Where more than 15 million people face severe food insecurity, blaming a lack of funding on the latest cuts, which will see the UN agency provide emergency food aid to just 3 million people. So you have Afghanistan, massive hunger, and as you described, DRC, the worst hunger in the world. And yet our first segment was about the West pouring billions into the war in Ukraine. Can you talk about what needs to be done in a global perspective right now?
What we need are summit meetings to deal with this exploding hunger crisis. We cannot call ourselves an international civilization or a European civilization or an American civilization unless we do something to avert this chronicle of an announced famine that is going to grip from Afghanistan to the Congo, to Somalia, to Yemen, to the Sahel, and beyond.
To the United States
has been the most generous donor over the last 2 years. The United States is cutting 20% of its humanitarian assistance now from last fiscal year to this one, and next year it will be a further cut in a situation where needs are exploding because of conflict and climate crisis. The Europeans are not stepping up and as they should be. And where are the Gulf countries really, or the large Asian economies? I think we have India. You put on backside of the moon. Could you also help in the Congo? There has to be summit meetings here where leaders, bigger economies, have to say we cannot let children massively die from hunger and neglect in 2023.
Jan Egeland, just before, if you could talk about, you also looked at the number of children, in addition, of course, to the hunger crisis, the number of children in Congo who are being prevented from receiving an education
Yes.
over 1 out of 3, if you could, of every child in the Congo, if you could talk about that.
Yeah, and that's very important. I mean, why do we do education in a situation where people cannot really feed themselves? Because education is hope to get out of the misery. So even starving parents and grandparents say, please educate our children, because that could mean that our community gets out of this dependence. We cannot live under dependence forever. So hundreds of schools have been destroyed or closed because of the violence, but hundreds of schools are also lacking the basic equipment to be running. We in the Norwegian Refugee Council are able now to provide, as of September, thousands of children sort of catch up classes. And these are, children, youth. I met 14, 15-year-old people who have never been to school because they've been fleeing all their life.
We have 20 seconds.
And they are able to go back to school now because
We got 20 seconds, and that's about all humanity has. Our friend here, Buckhold, asked who was Adolf really. Adolf really was a representation. He was a manufactured entity, and I would say the closest characters we have in our present time is the guy who had the Lolita Express, Jeffrey, whatever his name is. That guy, he came out of nowhere. He wasn't really rich. He wasn't really anything, but all of a sudden, he goes to college, becomes a friend of some kid. He goes home to meet the family. That kid's dad is part of a banking cartel. And then 2 years later, Jeffy is the most successful investment banker in the world. How'd that happen in 2 years? Right? How did he, have a net wealth of $10 billion? Really? And then what's he do with that money? But he sets up a spider's web of clubs, houses, and sex dens where he gets politicians and powerful people to come and visit and have a little vacation, and they get slipped a Mickey, and then they are videotaped doing something extraordinarily inappropriate, having sex with children and then murdering them and then eating their organs, something like that, And, basically everyone who's visited Lolita Island probably has done something to that sort. And then you have, again, another good representation of Adolf Hitler would be all of the, poster children of the new millennial trillionaires, guys like micro penis Billy Boy, can't cure stupid Mickey Musk, all the rest, Mr. Apple, you name it. They didn't invent anything. They were just poster boys. Was he Rothschild? You think? Well, who gave, how did Germany, that didn't lose World War One, they had an armistice, and then they went to Versailles and got emasculated. The French made them hand over all of their industry. They moved it out of German territory into France. They pushed Germany into depression, right? They started depression in 1920. And when we were in the Roaring 20s, the German people were experiencing deflation, inflation, and then hitting the fan. And then when they were at their worst, and they had the most democratic and well-educated, most highly reformed population, Adolf Hitler wins legally to become second in charge, right? And he moves in, and they go into the Reichstag, their Capitol building, and within 3 months they have a fire, and their Capitol, in January 6th, we just had some tourists walk through. There, they had the thing burnt to the ground, right? And basically, they had a thing called the Enabling Act. And if you take the Enabling Act and look at it in English, and take, Homeland Security and put them together, they are the same thing. And, the Nuremberg laws were taken straight from the United States version of, segregation, and so all of this is, and what's going on with Russia and the Ukraine has a total reflection into what is going on, the nationalist and nationalism and fascist motif of the United States, and anything that's and the ends, the super liberal and the super fascist are the same thing. They come around and are the same thing. It's the body politic, which isn't being exposed right now. How had he such charisma? Well, he had charisma through, anybody in any of these entities, like in the United States. You had every president, and almost a quarter of them have been members of some secret society. You look at, Georgie Porgy, both of the Georgie Porgies, they were from Skull and Bones. So was Mr. Ketchup, Bill Clinton, and FDR, and Harry Truman, and virtually every Democrat is belonged to some secret society. And when Kennedy he made speeches against central bank, secret societies, the CIA, and that there was technology out there that would change the world for the better. And in 5 weeks, about 3 weeks before he was whacked, in 5 weeks he made those speeches, right? And 3 weeks later, he's dead. And he knew he was a dead man walking. When he got to DC and they didn't have the bulletproof bubble, he knew you see the picture of him driving out of the airport. He's like sitting there like Frank Sinatra with a cigarette, and he's smoking it, like, yeah, okay. It's like his last cigarette. When are they going to shoot? They're going to shoot me any minute now. And that's kind of what it was. So it's starting to rain. And that's okay. I was going to do something, but I'm not going to do it now because it's raining. And hopefully what will happen is it will do a little bit of rain.
Iranian media report that in many cases the allegations were not substantiated and the detainees were subsequently released. Peter Kenyon, NPR News, Istanbul.
It's NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations.
Okay. Well, we've been doing this for 38 minutes. There's two of you there. Buckhold, anybody wants to get a hold of me, the dudewake42 at Gmail, dudewake42 at Gmail, dudewake42 at Gmail. All small, little guys, So, I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Okay? Okay. Hope you got something out of this show. And I'll catch you later. And